Welcome to the deep dive. How do we make sense of right and wrong, especially when we zoom out from our personal lives to look at the bigger picture of society? Today, we're diving into some, well, pretty fascinating ideas around this, looking at the work of Lawrence Kohlberg and a more recent sort of Neo-Kohlbergian take on moral development.
Yeah.
Our goal is to understand these frameworks for thinking about morality at a societal level. It's called macro-morality versus our everyday face-to-face interactions or micro-morality.
Right. That distinction is key.
We'll also explore a tool called the Defining Issues Test, or DIT, is to try and understand our moral judgments. Okay, let's get into it.
What's fascinating to consider is where Kohlberg first focused his attention. He was really interested in how individuals reason about the moral structures of society.
Go.
This became particularly relevant during periods of significant social change. Think about the moral arguments at the heart of the civil rights movement. The debates surrounding free speech, the Vietnam War, and, the growth of the women's movement. Kohlberg's work offered a way to analyze the moral reasoning that fueled these societal shifts.
So the key takeaway here is that Kohlberg provided a framework for understanding the moral reasoning behind societal shifts.
Exactly.
And when we talk about macro-morality, we're talking about these large-scale systems, institutions, laws, social roles. Think back to the McCarthy era and the moral questions it raised about freedom of expression.
Right, or the hippie movement challenging norms.
Or the counterculture of the hippie movement challenging established societal norms. Even something like the Bill of Rights is a foundational element of macro-morality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Micro-morality, in contrast, is more about our immediate personal interactions. A simple act of courtesy, caring for someone in need, or like being reliable in our commitments.
Being punctual, things like that.
While both are clearly important aspects of our moral lives, it seems Kohlberg's early work and the DIT later on really lean into understanding that broader societal or macro-moral landscape.
That's a really important distinction. And it's
Yeah.
also one of the reasons why Kohlberg's ideas have faced, well, scrutiny over time.
Okay.
You might have encountered some of this in the material you shared, arguments that his theory showed gender bias, that it blurred the line between genuine moral principles and mere social customs,
Right.
that it was influenced by particular cultural perspectives, perhaps even that it reflected a specific political viewpoint, was philosophically too simple, or didn't quite align with our day-to-day moral experiences.
Right. Sounds like some felt his framework maybe didn't fully capture the richness and complexity of our moral lives.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where this Neo-Kohlbergian perspective comes into play, trying to build on his work while addressing some of these concerns.
Exactly. The Neo-Kohlbergian approach, while it does introduce some significant changes, still holds on to some core ideas from Kohlberg. There's still a strong emphasis on the cognitive side of things, the mental processes involved in making moral judgments. It also keeps the idea that we actively construct our own understanding of fundamental moral concepts like rights, duties, and justice.
Okay.
Furthermore, there's the developmental aspect, the general idea that as we mature, our moral reasoning tends to become more sophisticated.
Higher is better kind of thing.
Yeah, that higher is better idea. And finally, it also follows the notion of a shift from more conventional ways of thinking about morality to what's considered post-conventional thinking. So it's an evolution of his ideas, not a complete overhaul.
Okay, so they agree on those fundamental points, but where do they start to differ from Kohlberg? The material mentions that even the way they try to understand someone's moral reasoning is quite different.
Yes, the methods they use to assess moral reasoning are a key point of divergence. Kohlberg primarily relied on in-depth interviews. He would present people with hypothetical moral dilemmas and ask them to explain their reasoning behind their choices. The Neo-Kohlbergian approach, largely through the Defining Issues Test, takes a different path.
Okay.
It uses a multiple choice format where you read different considerations related to a moral dilemma and then rate and rank how important you think each one is in making a decision.
That sounds like a much more structured way of doing things compared to those open-ended interviews. I can see why Kohlberg might have been a bit hesitant about it.
Yeah.
The source mentions he even referred to the DIT as quick and dirty,
He did.
maybe suggesting he was sacrificing depth for efficiency. He really valued what he saw as the richness and nuance that came from those detailed interview responses.
And his concern was understandable, For a long time, the prevailing idea in the field was that to truly understand someone's moral compass, you needed to hear them articulate their reasoning in their own words.
Right.
But the Neo-Kohlbergian perspective challenges this somewhat. It draws on findings from cognitive science and social psychology that suggest we're not always fully aware of or able to accurately explain the underlying processes of our own thinking. We can often report what we think, but the how of our thinking can be less accessible to our conscious awareness.
That makes a lot of sense. We all have those moments where we just have a gut feeling that something is right or wrong, but trying to explain exactly why can be surprisingly difficult.
Absolutely.
The source gives some interesting examples of these unconscious cognitive processes, like that experiment with the strange shapes where people preferred the ones they'd seen before, even if they didn't remember seeing them.
Yeah, the mere exposure effect.
Or how experts in a particular field can often solve complex problems without being able to fully lay out their step-by-step thought process.
Exactly. These examples highlight that there are limitations to relying solely on what people can consciously report about their thinking. Recognition tasks, where you choose from a set of options, like in the DIT, are generally easier than production tasks,
Okay.
where you have to generate the answer from scratch, as in Kohlberg's interviews.
Ah.
One interesting consequence of this difference in assessment is that post-conventional thinking, those more advanced levels of moral reasoning, were actually observed relatively rarely using Kohlberg's interview method.
Really?
Yeah. The DIT, by offering those statements for people to recognize and rank, tends to identify post-conventional thinking more frequently.
That's a pretty significant difference right there. So it's not just a different way of asking the questions. It might actually give us a different picture of how people reason morally.
Precisely.
The outline also talks about a shift from thinking in terms of fixed stages to something called schemas. What's the thinking behind that change?
This is another really key area where the Neo-Kohlbergian approach diverges. Kohlberg, following Piaget's lead, viewed cognitive development as happening in distinct stages, almost like climbing a set of stairs,
Right, it's staircase model.
where you move from one level to the next in a relatively fixed order. The Neo-Kohlbergian approach, drawing on schema theory, sees things a bit differently. Schemas are like general frameworks of knowledge that we store in our long-term memory.
Okay.
We develop these frameworks based on our experiences as we notice patterns and regularities in the world around us.
So they're like mental blueprints for understanding things. The source mentions different types of schemas, person schemas, event schemas, role schemas, like our understanding of what a typical birthday party is like, or the general characteristics we associate with a doctor.
Precisely. These schemas help us direct our attention, organize new information, fill in any missing details, and help us solve problems.
Right.
Now, the Neo-Kohlbergian perspective positions moral schemas somewhere in between Piaget's strict developmental stages and the more general schemas studied in social cognition.
Okay.
The important distinction is that while social cognition often focuses on how these knowledge structures function, it doesn't always emphasize how they develop and change over time. Moral schemas, in the Neo-Kohlbergian view, still have that developmental aspect, that sense of growth and increasing sophistication.
Okay, so instead of these rigid step-by-step stages, we have these moral schemas that evolve and become more refined over time. The outline lists 5 key differences between these moral schemas and Kohlberg's stages. Let's unpack the first one. The idea of soft versus hard stages.
Right. Kohlberg's hard stage model, with that staircase analogy, implies a very linear progression. You move up one stage at a time, you can't skip levels, and you don't really go backward. While some early research seemed to support this, more contemporary views, like Siegler's overlapping waves metaphor, suggest a soft stage approach.
Overlapping waves.
This means that at any given time, we might be drawing on multiple different ways of thinking about a moral issue. Development, then, becomes more about a gradual shift in how frequently we use these different approaches, with new, more sophisticated ways of thinking becoming more dominant over time.
I see.
It's less about a strict step-by-step climb and more about a changing mix of strategies.
That sounds much more flexible and probably aligns better with our own experiences. We don't always think about moral dilemmas in exactly the same way, even as we mature.
Yeah, I think so.
The second difference is that these moral schemas are seen as more specific and concrete compared to Kohlberg's more abstract stages.
Exactly. Kohlberg defined his stages based on very abstract principles he called justice operations. The Neo-Kohlbergian approach views moral schemas as being more closely tied to our understanding of social institutions and the roles that people play within those institutions. While there's still general frameworks for understanding, they're more directly related to how we think about the moral basis of things like laws, government, and social norms. Kohlberg, on the other hand, tended to see these social institutions more as the content to which those abstract justice operations were applied.
That makes sense. So instead of just focusing on abstract ideas of fairness,
Mm.
the schemas are more connected to how we understand the fairness of specific social systems we encounter.
Right.
The third point is about how we assess these things, the DIT, looking at our understanding of social institutions rather than directly measuring those justice operations.
Yes. Kohlberg was very influenced by Piaget's idea that more advanced reasoning involves using increasingly complex logical operations. He tried to define his moral stages in terms of these underlying justice operations, with his highest stage, stage 6, being characterized by this concept of ideal reversibility.
Ideal reversibility.
His scoring system was designed to try and strip away the specific content of a person's response to get at this underlying logical structure of their reasoning. He felt that the DIT was flawed because it didn't make this sharp distinction between the content of a moral issue and the underlying structure of thought.
So he thought the DIT was too focused on what people were saying, rather than the fundamental way they were thinking about it.
Precisely. He believed that the more abstract the level of analysis, the better you could understand someone's true moral competence.
Well, the Neo-Kohlbergians pushed back.
Well, the Neo-Kohlbergian view, which reflects a broader perspective within American cognitive science, isn't as focused on this complete separation of content and structure. As researchers in cognitive science have pointed out, we're primarily aware of the content of our thoughts, not the underlying mechanisms.
Right, we know what we're thinking, not how.
Exactly. The argument here is that the key isn't necessarily how abstractly you can define the structure of moral thought, but rather whether your definition can be clearly measured and, more importantly, whether it helps us understand and predict how people actually behave in moral situations.
Okay, validation is key.
Right. The proponents of the DIT argue that focusing on our understanding of social institutions provides a more practical and valid way to assess moral judgment.
That leads us to the fourth difference, the question of universality. Kohlberg famously argued that his stages were universal, that people in all cultures go through the same sequence.
Yes, a huge claim.
Even if they progress at different rates or reach different endpoints. This was a really important part of his theory, as he saw it as a defense against the idea of moral relativism.
Yes, Kohlberg saw this idea of universal moral principles as a crucial counter to the idea that morality is just a matter of cultural opinion, that anything goes.
Which he saw as dangerous.
He presented a rather stark choice. Either there are universal moral principles that we can all strive towards, or we fall into a dangerous relativism where things that seem clearly wrong to us could be considered acceptable in other societies. He even connected this fear of relativism to the atrocities of the Nazi Holocaust.
But the Neo-Kohlbergian perspective seems to approach this idea of universality in a different way.
They do. Drawing on the work of contemporary moral philosophers, they tend to see morality more as something that develops within specific communities and social contexts.
So more culturally situated.
Yes, it takes into account the particular situations, the established ways of doing things, and the ongoing discussions and aspirations of that community. This doesn't necessarily mean they embrace that anything goes relativism that Kohlberg worried about.
Yeah.
Instead, they argue that while moral understandings might differ across communities, they can still be subject to internal debate, critical evaluation, and refinement based on shared ideals and moral intuitions. They suggest there's more complexity than just universalism on one hand and complete relativism on the other.
That's a really important point. It suggests that morality can be rooted in the values of a particular community without necessarily being arbitrary or leading to harmful outcomes.
Right, it allows for nuance.
The final difference mentioned is the emphasis on what's called tacit recognition in the DIT versus Kohlberg's focus on people being able to verbally explain their reasoning in the interviews.
Yeah.
We touched on this a bit earlier.
Yeah, we did.
With the idea that recognizing something is often easier than producing a detailed explanation of it.
Exactly. The DIT, by presenting those statements and asking you to rate and rank them, taps into a level of understanding that you might not be able to easily put into words.
Like a gut feeling, almost.
Sort of. You might recognize that a particular consideration is morally important and give it a high rating without necessarily being able to construct a sophisticated philosophical argument explaining why it's so important.
Whereas Kohlberg's interviews demanded that articulation.
Exactly. Kohlberg's interviews, with their requirement for detailed verbal justifications, placed a much greater emphasis on that ability to articulate your moral reasoning explicitly.
So the idea is that the DIT is designed to activate these moral schemas that we have. If a statement in the DIT resonates with your preferred way of thinking about moral issues, you'll tend to give it a higher rating. If it doesn't make sense or seems too simplistic, it'll get a lower score. It's like the DIT presents these little fragments of moral reasoning, and we, as the test takers, have to fill in the meaning based on our existing schemas.
Precisely. It's often described as being somewhat like a projective test in that way. The fact that the items or these brief statements requires the person taking the test to supply their own interpretation and meaning, drawing on those internal moral frameworks they've developed. The focus isn't on whether you can produce a flawless philosophical argument on the spot, but rather on identifying the schemas that you typically rely on when you're thinking about moral dilemmas. And as we discussed earlier, the rating and ranking format allows for this kind of implicit understanding to be expressed without the need for that explicit verbal justification that was so central to Kohlberg's method.
This brings us to how the Neo-Kohlbergian approach has reconceptualized what it means to reach that higher level of moral reasoning, what they call post-conventional morality. Kohlberg, as we mentioned, drew heavily on Rawls' A Theory of Justice to define his highest stage, stage 6.
Yes, a very specific length.
Really aligning it with those core liberal Enlightenment values.
Yes, Kohlberg made a really interesting move in connecting Rawls' philosophical ideas about justice with his own psychological theory of moral development. Rawls' thought experiment about the original position under a veil of ignorance.
Ah, yes, the veil of ignorance.
The idea of deciding on the principles for a just society without knowing your own position in that society had a strong influence on Kohlberg's understanding of post-conventional thinking, particularly his concept of ideal reversibility. For Kohlberg, reaching stage 6 was both a developmental endpoint and a kind of normative ideal of how we should reason about justice.
But this close connection to Rawls also led to some of the criticisms of Kohlberg's theory, right? Some felt it made his framework too specific, too tied to one particular philosophical viewpoint.
Exactly. Many moral philosophers raised concerns that Kohlberg's interpretation of Rawls was too narrow and that his theory ended up being somewhat, well, partisan.
Okay.
The Neo-Kohlbergian approach takes a step back from this direct link. It offers a broader definition of post-conventionality, one that isn't tied to any single specific moral philosophy.
Right.
Instead, it focuses on the idea of deriving our understanding of rights and responsibilities from shared ideals for cooperation that are open to critical examination and public debate.
So it's less about adhering to a particular philosophical framework and more about a general way of approaching moral reasoning at that higher level.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The source mentions that this broader definition could potentially include thinkers with quite different perspectives, from liberals like Rawls to conservatives like Sandel, communitarians like Walser, and even libertarians like Nozick.
That's right. The key is that these diverse perspectives all engage with the fundamental idea of justifying moral principles through shared ideals that are subject to open discussion and reasoned argument.
Okay.
On the other hand, the Neo-Kohlbergian view would tend to exclude moral theories like emotivism, the idea that morality is just an expression of emotions, or fundamentalist religious views that base morality solely on divine decree without allowing for any form of human scrutiny or debate.
It's interesting how they distinguish between these developmental moral schemas and our political ideologies. It's easy to sometimes assume that someone who demonstrates more advanced moral reasoning would automatically align with a particular political viewpoint.
That's a really crucial distinction to make. While there can be some general associations, for instance, people who primarily favor maintaining established norms might tend to lean more conservative, and those with a more post-conventional orientation might find more alignment with liberal positions. They're not the same thing.
Okay.
Both left-wing and right-wing political ideologies have evolved over time and can be criticized for various injustices. And importantly, both can manifest in ways that reflect less or more sophisticated moral reasoning. The development of moral judgment, particularly the shift towards those Maintaining Norms and Post-Conventional Schemas, is really about how we approach the problem of societal cooperation,
Right.
moving from an unquestioning acceptance of authority and existing rules to a stance of greater accountability and critical scrutiny.
Okay, let's delve into these specific moral schemas themselves. The source outlines three: personal interests,
Yeah.
maintaining norms, and post-conventional. It mentions that adolescence is often a key period where we experience this discovery of society, realizing the complexity of institutions and rules that extend beyond our immediate personal relationships.
Exactly. It's that growing awareness that there's a larger system at play, a macro morality, alongside our more immediate micromoral interactions.
Right.
The DIT framework suggests that we tend to use these three developmentally ordered schemas to make sense of moral situations. The personal interest schema is seen as more typical of childhood,
Okay.
where moral judgments are primarily based on personal needs and affection for those close to us. This aligns with what Kohlberg described as his stages 2 and 3.
Mhm.
Interestingly, research using the DIT, which typically involves adolescents and adults, often finds that participants view this personal interest schema as a less sophisticated way of thinking that they've generally moved beyond.
And then we have the maintaining norms schema, which the source suggests is often the first way adolescents start to think about how to cooperate within society as a whole.
What are the main characteristics of this schema? The maintaining norms schema, which connects to Kohlberg's stage 4, is really characterized by a recognition of the necessity of having shared rules and norms for social order, stability, and predictability.
Okay, order is key.
Yes. It's about understanding the need for laws that apply uniformly to everyone in society, not just to the people we know personally. There's a sense of what you might call partial reciprocity. We follow the rules and do our duty, expecting that others in society will do the same.
Right.
It's also strongly duty-oriented and tends to emphasize respect for established authority and the existing social system,
Mhm.
not necessarily based on personal admiration for the individuals in power, but out of a sense of obligation to the overall system. In this schema, maintaining social order is often seen as the defining characteristic of what is moral, with law being very closely linked to this idea of moral order.
Okay.
There's often an underlying assumption that without these established norms, society would descend into chaos.
It sounds like a very rule-based and authority-respecting way of thinking. But the source also points out some potential downsides,
It does?
such as an exaggerated conventional-mindedness, where anyone who challenges the established norms might be seen as inherently bad, and there's a potential risk of suppressing individual rights and freedoms in the name of protecting social order.
Precisely. While it represents a crucial developmental step in understanding how larger-scale societal cooperation works, the maintaining norms schema can become quite rigid and even potentially oppressive if taken to an extreme,
Right.
prioritizing the maintenance of order above principles of justice or the protection of individual rights.
Now let's move on to the post-conventional schema. This is where moral obligations are based on shared ideals, are open to debate and logical consistency, and are informed by the community's broader experience. It sounds like a more flexible and critically engaged way of thinking about morality.
Absolutely. The post-conventional schema represents a move beyond simply accepting established laws and social norms without question. It involves recognizing that these are human-created arrangements that can be changed, and that the mere fact that something is the norm doesn't automatically make it ethically right. There's a primacy given to underlying moral criteria, a sense that conventions and laws should serve fundamental moral purposes.
Right.
This schema also involves appealing to an ideal, proposing constructive visions for how humans can interact and organize their societies based on principles like fairness, the greatest good, individual rights, or other overarching moral frameworks.
And these ideals have to be shareable, meaning they're not just personal opinions or beliefs that can't be justified to others through reasoned argument.
Exactly. Justifications at this level need to go beyond simply saying, my conscience tells me so. They involve articulating why a particular action or principle doesn't unfairly benefit oneself at the expense of others, why it respects the rights and dignity of individuals, why it serves broader group goals, and why it's consistent with other agreed-upon principles. Importantly, these justifications are also open to rational critique, new information, and logical analysis.
So no unquestionable authority.
Right. There's no single unquestionable authority that trumps reasoned debate and shared human experience. Even religious insights in this framework are typically subjected to scrutiny by those affected, as well as considerations of logical consistency and broader human experience.
The last element of this schema is full reciprocity, which goes beyond the uniform application of laws seen in the maintaining norms scheming,
Uh-huh.
to also consider whether the laws themselves are just and fair, not unfairly benefiting some groups at the expense of others.
That's right. It's about ensuring that the very foundations of the social order are equitable, not just that they're applied consistently across the board.
Okay.
The source uses the example of Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil disobedience to illustrate a challenge to laws that were seen as fundamentally unjust.
Right.
Ultimately, the post-conventional schema seeks to build consensus and resolve moral disagreements by appealing to these shared ideals and principles of logical coherence, rather than simply relying on established traditions or the dictates of authority, as is more characteristic of the maintaining norms schema.
So we have these three different ways of thinking about morality. But is there solid evidence that the DIT actually measures these schemas and that these schemas really do relate to how we approach moral questions in the real world?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
The outline mentions a lot of research supporting the validity of the DIT.
Yes. Over the past 25 years or so, there's been a really substantial body of research, hundreds of individual studies that have investigated the validity of the DIT.
Hundreds, wow.
Yeah. This research has looked at whether the DIT scores correlate with other things we'd expect them to if they're truly measuring moral judgment. They've examined it against several key criteria, all contributing to what we call construct validity.
Okay.
Essentially, does the test actually measure the underlying concept it's supposed to be measuring?
What are some of the key things this research has found?
Well, one important finding is that DIT scores tend to increase with age and education. We see a clear trend where people with more years of education generally score higher on the DIT.
Makes sense.
Secondly, longitudinal studies, which follow the same people over time, have shown that individuals tend to show gains in their DIT scores as they get older, particularly during their college years, suggesting a developmental trend.
Ah, college makes a difference.
It seems to. Thirdly, DIT scores have been found to correlate significantly with other measures of cognitive abilities, especially those related to understanding moral concepts. Fourth, research has shown that the DIT is sensitive to moral education programs.
Okay.
People who participate in discussions of moral dilemmas tend to show greater increases in their DIT scores compared to those who don't.
So interventions can work.
Yes. Fifth, and quite interestingly, DIT scores have been linked to various real-world behaviors such as pro-social actions and more ethically sound decision-making in professional settings.
So it connects to actual behavior.
There's evidence for that, yes. Sixth, DIT scores have also been found to correlate with political attitudes and even predict how people feel about various controversial public policy issues.
Interesting link there.
And finally, the DIT has demonstrated good reliability, meaning that people tend to get consistent scores if they take the test multiple times.
That sounds like a pretty strong body of evidence supporting its validity. It seems to hold up across different types of studies and even relates to how people think and behave outside of the test itself.
It does seem quite robust.
The source also mentions something called discriminant validity, meaning it's measuring something different from things like general intelligence or political leaning.
Yes, that's important too.
And it works equally well for men and women.
Exactly. The research has shown that the DIT measures something distinct from general verbal abilities or overall intelligence, and also from simply being politically conservative or liberal. It seems to be tapping into a specific aspect of moral reasoning.
Okay.
And yes, the research consistently shows that it's a valid measure for both males and females, with gender accounting for a very small percentage of the variation in scores, much less than factors like education.
Wow, education is that much more powerful.
Apparently so. There have even been updates and refinements to the test over time, leading to the DIT-2, which is even more robust. So the overall conclusion is that moral judgment is a well-supported concept, and the DIT appears to be a good tool for measuring it.
Now, the really intriguing question, do these moral schemas actually guide how we think when we're faced with moral choices?
Right, the mechanism question.
The source mentions some research that tries to get at this, even though it's tricky because, as we've discussed, people often draw on a mix of these schemas rather than just one.
This is where it gets really interesting. Because we don't typically see individuals who operate purely from a single stage or schema, the researchers developed a way to categorize people into different types based on which schema was most dominant in their responses on the DIT,
Okay.
and how consistent or mixed their preferences were. This resulted in a framework with 6 different types. They then looked at 3 novel phenomena related to these types to see if they aligned with what schema theory would predict.
And what were those 3 key phenomena they examined?
The first was whether these different types showed a developmental ordering, meaning did they tend to appear in a sequence that makes sense from a developmental perspective.
Okay.
The second was whether having a more consolidated preference for one type of schema made it easier or more difficult to process moral information.
Processing ease.
Yeah. And the third was whether people with different dominant schemas, even if they were equally good at processing information, tended to have different opinions on actual public policy issues.
Right. Connecting back to the real world again.
Yeah.
And what did they find? Did these phenomena support the idea that these schemas are actually influencing our moral thinking?
Yes, the findings were quite supportive. They found that the different types did indeed show a developmental ordering. They also discovered that individuals with more consolidated schema preferences tended to show greater ease and consistency in how they processed the moral dilemmas on the DIT. For example, they had fewer can't decide answers, and their scores were more consistent across different dilemmas. Interestingly, they even found that one of the transitional types, even though it was developmentally more advanced overall, showed less of this processing ease, suggesting that being in a state of shifting between schemas can actually make moral decision-making more challenging.
Wow. So being transitional is harder work mentally.
It seems that way. Finally, they found that individuals with different dominant schemas, even those who were equally good at processing information, tended to have significantly different opinions on a range of public policy issues,
Right.
suggesting a link between these underlying moral cognitive structures and our broader moral attitudes.
That's fascinating, especially the idea that being in that in-between stage of moral development might actually lead to more internal conflict and difficulty in processing moral information. It makes a certain intuitive sense.
It does. The researchers even considered alternative explanations for these findings, such as the idea that the DIT might just be measuring verbal ability or general political attitudes.
Wow.
But they found that those alternative theories couldn't adequately explain all 3 of these phenomena together. The way schema theory and the research on moral judgment using the DIT seem to fit together really strengthens the case for understanding moral development in this way.
So to bring it all together, the Neo-Kohlbergian approach, with its focus on schema theory and the use of the DIT, provides a really valuable framework for understanding how we develop our moral compass, particularly when we think about morality at that broader societal level.
Yeah, definitely.
It builds upon Kohlberg's initial insights, but offers some important revisions in how we conceptualize moral development, how we try to measure it, and how we understand those higher levels of moral reasoning.
Absolutely.
And the extensive research on the DIT seems to provide a solid empirical foundation for these ideas, especially with these newer findings linking different schema preferences to how we process information and make decisions about social issues.
That's a great way to summarize it. We've seen a shift from Kohlberg's more rigid stage theory and interview-based assessment to a more dynamic model of moral schemas assessed through a recognition-based test,
Right.
along with a more inclusive understanding of post-conventional morality. The body of research around the DIT offers substantial support for the idea that these underlying moral schemas play a significant role in shaping how we think about and respond to the moral challenges we face in the world.
This has truly been a deep dive, and it leaves me with this final thought for you, our listener. Think about some of the significant societal debates that are happening right now, maybe discussions around social justice, environmental policy, or economic inequality.
Good point.
How might the distinction between maintaining norms thinking, with its emphasis on established rules and respect for authority, and post-conventional thinking, with its focus on underlying ideals of fairness and open debate, be influencing the different arguments you're hearing?
Yeah, where do those arguments fit?
What kinds of justifications are being offered, and which of these moral schemas might they reflect? It's definitely something interesting to consider as you navigate the complex moral landscape of our world. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.